How was artillery restored to its place of prime importance on the battlefield? We look at the role of artillery at 2nd Alamein.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 88 of the Principles of War podcast. This is the next episode in our series of episodes commemorating 150 years of Australian artillery. There will be a couple of episodes looking at artillery at 2nd Alamein for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I want to take a all-of-core look at the role that artillery played. I want to look at ground-based air defence. I want to look at surveillance and target acquisition. We're going to look at anti-tank. We're going to look at the field and medium guns and how all of that was orchestrated and synchronized to create the effect on the battlefield. But more importantly, I think we need to look at the way that that integrated with the rest of the army to create the combined arms effect, because that's so important. Then we want to go one step up and we want to look at how artillery interacted within the joint force that Montgomery had at his disposal. This is one of the big changes that Montgomery brought about, was the way that the 8th Army fought in the desert. But it's also really important to look at the role that the Australian artillery played. So this is 9th Divisional Artillery, because this is the apogee of Australian artillery in the Second World War. Brigadier Ramsay, he commands the largest number of guns in the field of any Australian artillery commander. In the history of the Second World War, this is an important battle. 9th Division plays a crucial role in that, and the artillery was fundamental in setting the conditions for 9th Division to prevail on the battlefield. So we need to look at how all of this came together. And there are some really important lessons that are just as relevant today as they were back in 1942. I started this episode with a little bit of a controversial quote. However, I'm actually quoting Winston Churchill. And he had written, "Renown awaits the commander who first in this war restores artillery to its prime importance upon the battlefield, from which it has been ousted by heavily armoured tanks." This quote has traditionally been associated with Montgomery, the way that he used artillery, masses of artillery, in his design for battle. However, there are two things that Montgomery had going for him that were well and truly in his favour. Firstly, he inherited a lot of great planning. He inherited the large number of resupplies that came, a lot of guns, a lot of tanks, and a huge amount of ammunition and fuel. That made a big difference in the left and right of arc of the possible actions that he could take. On top of that, he had time. Auchinleck, you can see, as he was trying to stop the Axis advances, he was trying to develop doctrine. He was developing doctrine on the run, literally while he was in contact with the Axis. Montgomery had the time to be able to sort out what it was that Auchinleck was trying to do. He was trying to develop the command and control structures that were required to be able to generate the concentration of artillery that was needed. And we're going to look at how that process panned out. A lot of the changes that were brought in for 2nd Alamein were around the command and control of the artillery. We've already discussed the way that Monty used artillery to compensate for the poor performance of his armoured divisions. He rebalanced the combined arms equation to support what the 8th Army had as far as materials available and what it could do as far as the capabilities that their training and equipment allowed them to perform. We'll look at Brigadier Alan Ramsay. He would go on to be a Major General, a divisional commander later in the war. We're going to look at the work that he did in training his staff, developing the procedures that set the benchmark for some of the later battles, including many of those in Europe, because the staff work that he was able to generate, that his headquarters were able to generate, Montgomery recognised as being best practice. Now, one of the important things to note here is that Ramsay and many of his staff were veterans of World War I. The battle that was conducted was in many ways very reminiscent of a World War I battle, and particularly the artillery planning for 2nd Alamein. As we go through the planning for the battle, you'll see significant similarities between the planning for a battle like Vimy Ridge. the way that the counter-battery office operated, the flash spotting, the sound ranging, the impact that was generated on the defenders as the assault was taking place. And I think this harkens back to the enduring nature of the way that the dilemma is created by combined arms. When looking to create the combined arms effect, a good commander is aiming to impale the enemy on the horns of a dilemma. As the enemy infantry approaches your defensive position, you want to have your machine gunners up and observing into the engagement areas. You want to have your joint fires observers coordinating those defensive fires. You want to have your anti-tank gunners up with good sight pictures out over the area in front of them so that they can engage any tanks. And if it's infantry by itself, you should be able to achieve all of those. And unless they have overwhelming numerical superiority, you should be able to defend a position quite easily. However, if it's a combined arms assault, it's going to be a lot more difficult. There will be artillery raining down on your defensive positions, making sure that everyone is in their dugouts as low as they can be. They're not going to be observing the infantry as they come up. There might be armour coming in, generating that shock action so that the amount of time that the assault is going for is minimal. This is the cognitive effect that you're trying to generate. You're going to force the enemy into a dilemma which they cannot overcome or ignore, and they become psychologically paralysed, and even inaction is deadly. So what we're planning on doing, we're going to look at a description of the forces, both Allied and Axis. We're going to look at the lead-up preparations. We're going to look at the way that the fire plan was generated. I also want to have a look at some of the artillery tasks that were carried out, because there's quite a wide range of them. And we'll look at some of the innovations that occurred. Now, the references for this, we've got David Horner's The Gunners, Shelford Bidwell, Gunners at War. That's a fantastic book, well worth the read. My copy is falling apart. I think I need to get another copy of it. Do Unto Others by Alan Smith. His other book, The Battle Winners, was also an excellent resource. And lastly, The Development of Artillery Tactics and Equipment. This is a lessons learnt written in the 50s by Brigadier Pemberton. That is also an excellent read. So to create a little bit of context for everyone, if this is the first Alamein podcast that you're listening to, 9th Division is rushed to Egypt from Syria in the crisis of June 1942. The Axis are advancing very speedily towards Cairo. 9th Division had had 6 months' worth of training, but it was still not fully equipped. Only one of the field regiments had all of its vehicles, only one anti-tank battery had all of its 2-pounders, and there were no 6-pounders within the division. Now, the 2-pounder, at this stage of the war, really getting towards being obsolete. The only way that it could be employed was if it was able to attack on a flank, to be able to strike at the tank on its weaker side armour. This is the result of a production decision that was made in 1939. The question was whether they should look to develop a better anti-tank weapon or if they should continue making the 2-pounder. And it was decided to run with the 2-pounder because at least they would then have some anti-tank weapons in the field. And at that stage of the war, they were critically short of any anti-tank weapons. Critically for 9th Division artillery, all of the units, except for the 2nd, 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, had seen action at Tobruk or in the Western Desert. So this was a division that was fairly well trained, had already seen combat, and that makes a big difference when it comes to generating combat power. Auchinleck had been experimenting with jock columns, a fairly good way of creating an asymmetric threat with which to threaten an adversary. However, not great, particularly when the employment of jock columns was coming at the expense of the ability to concentrate the artillery. Auchinleck, as we've said though, he was starting to look at mechanisms for being able to do this, and he was trying to construct some brigade-level engagements. Leslie Morshead, the commander of 9th Division, he had been resisting this. His way was for the division to stay as one and to fight as a division. This is partially because it makes good sense, concentration of force, but also because of his responsibilities as the senior commander of the Australian forces in a multinational environment. He didn't want the troops to be employed piecemeal. He was able to resist the urgings of Auchinleck to have his brigades fight independently. This critically meant that he would be able to generate the full capabilities of the divisional artillery. And we see this at the Battle of First El Alamein. The Australians, they're fighting at Tel El Isa, the 2nd 24th Battalion on the 10th and 11th of July. They are supported by divisional artillery. The divisional artillery supporting a battalion, so that's quite a lot of artillery for a battalion assault, but it was able to generate and this is described in the official history, a barrage of intensity not heard before in the desert, announced that the 8th Army was making its first advance. Bombardier David Goodhart of the 2nd 7th wrote that it was a thrilling morning. We knew within ourselves that certain quiet knowledge that not only had we surprised and outwitted him, but that he could not and would not stand before our fiery and single-minded onslaught. So 26th Brigade, they're able to take their objectives, but there is, as expected, a significant German counterattack. Bombardier Bill Cutler wrote in his diary, "Jerry's not easily discouraged. Today he redoubled his efforts. A terrific artillery duel developed and continued into the evening. Our OP was shelled 3 times and it was impossible to re-establish communications by line. The initial onslaught and the continuing action has called for superhuman efforts from the men on the guns." The gun lines and other critical locations are attacked repeatedly by Stukas, and it's the gunners of the 2nd, 3rd light anti-aircraft with their 40mm Bofors. They're in combat for their first time, staunchly defending their positions. The fiercest fighting during First El Alamein fell to the anti-tank gunners, as it often did. Using their 2-pounders, which had to be sighted in innovative ways so that they would be able to engage the tanks on their sides, they were able to destroy 18 enemy tanks, and together the Australians had taken 1,150 prisoners. 4 anti-tank gunners would win the Distinguished Conduct Medal during First El Alamein. But it wasn't just the anti-tank gunners who had a role in repelling the tank counterattacks. Here is the diary entry of a FOO assistant. So a FOO is a Forward Observation Officer, and this FOO assistant from the 2nd 12th Field Regiment is Lance Bombardier George Steele, and he's writing about his FOO, Lieutenant Gordon Stewart. Enemy tanks broke through, heading towards us and what was left of the battalion in that sector. Sam seemed to be enjoying the experience as he gave me fire orders to radio back to the guns. At the same time, he asked me to request that the whole regiment be brought onto the target. Over the air, I was answered by the familiar and distinctive voice of Major Robert Jones. The conversation went something like this. "What are you shooting at?" I answered, "Tanks, sir." "How many of them?" "About 20, sir." "Are you sure they're not ours?" "Bloody sure, sir." Jockey immediately stated, "The regiment is on target and ready to fire." A regimental barrage arriving on target is a wonderful sight. I don't recall how many rounds were fired or how long the barrage lasted, but when the shelling stopped, those tanks still mobile had been driven off and the others no longer a problem. Now, unless you've got smart or brilliant munitions, so munitions that can be guided onto armoured vehicles, you're going to have to be incredibly lucky to destroy a tank with artillery. Which is why VT, variable time, or mechanical time, so something with a fuse so that the round is going to explode in the air, is the weapon of choice against armour. What it does is it creates a significant amount of shrapnel. What you're looking to do with that shrapnel is to do things like damage the aerials, damage the periscopes that they're using to look out, and most importantly, they're going to button up. They're not going to be sticking their head out looking at what's going on. You're going to significantly degrade their situational awareness. That means that your anti-tank gunners can now sit up. They can take the time that they need to get a great sight picture to be able to strike. The easiest way that an attacker can protect his tanks from the anti-tank gunners is, of course, with infantry coming along. And if there is VT coming down, all of that shrapnel, that will very quickly reorientate the attacking infantry as to their priorities. No longer will they be looking for the anti-tank gunners. They'll be thinking about self-preservation and getting out of the area with all of that shrapnel. On the 13th of July, the South African Royal Durban Light Infantry were in a critical fight in the Alamein box. They were under significant pressure from Rommel's advance, and the 9th Division, the whole of the artillery, was able to support them in that defence. And this was a critical moment in the Battle of First Alamein. So we are starting to see the use of divisional artillery. That's 72 guns or thereabouts. So a significant amount of firepower being brought into a small amount of terrain, a really good way of dissuading the enemy from continuing their assault. So critically, we're seeing divisional artillery. Critically, we're starting to see divisional artillery firing across divisional boundaries. So you're starting to see the better command and control, because this is actually quite a difficult thing to do, to fire in support of another division and to get all of those guns onto that target. But we're starting to see this at First Alamein, and this is under Auchinleck. Lieutenant General Montgomery takes over in August, and we start to see the development of the training and doctrine for the way that Montgomery wants to fight his offensive battle. Alan Smith describes the period. After 3 months in the line, the gun regiments had been relieved in rotation for training and affiliation exercises to prepare them for the forthcoming battle. The training was conducted with infantry and, where possible, armour in an area to the rear of the Tel El-Isa El Alamein defensive position. These rigorous exercises spared no discomfort or eventuality, the brunt of which was naturally borne by the heavily laden infantry. Minefields and defences were constructed to reflect their employment under Montgomery's plan. The aim was to ensure that all soldiers were battle-hardened and fit. Confidence born of experience, as Morshead had commented. Reinforcements were marched in to make good losses, and critically, equipment shortages were rectified, the regiments being bring up to their establishment strength, some officers reposted, and troops enjoyed some good food and amenities. Similarly, 3 months on operations had revealed that some soldiers simply could not cope with strafing, bombing, and hostile battery fire. In September, the first of a series of 6-day leave periods was granted to all ranks to visit Cairo and Alexandria, where it was possible to buy bottled beer. This was a very welcome interlude given the exertions of the previous 9 weeks. In between 1st and 2nd El Alamein, there is the Battle of Alam Halfa. Now, 9th Division didn't fight in Alam Halfa, but they did conduct a diversionary attack that was Op Balimba. Monty wrote after Alam Halfa, "The concentrated fire of artillery is a battle-winning factor of the first importance. Artillery command must be concentrated under the CRA of the division so that he can use the divisional artillery as a 72-gun battery where necessary. Once the enemy shows signs of giving up, he must be shot up by artillery from all sides." During this period, the regiments are resupplied. 6-pounders come into all of the anti-tank elements within 8th Army. The 2nd, 3rd anti-tank got 64 of the new 6-pounders. The 2-pounders went to the infantry. So each infantry battalion now had an 8-gun anti-tank platoon. What does that say about the importance of the role of anti-tank fires when there is a significant tank-based enemy? Because not only do you have regiments with anti-tank weapons, but you've also got organic anti-tank capability within the infantry battalion. This is a significantly different orbat to what we would see in many armies' battalions today. Even though, when we look at contemporary operations, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, we see a significant armoured vehicle threat. By the start of 2nd El Alamein, there were 832 25-pounders in 8th Army. There was also 32 4.5-inch guns, 20 5.5-inch guns, 24 105mm guns, 735 6-pounders, and 521 2-pounders. So the 6 and 2-pounders, they're your anti-tank guns. 9th Division, when it was going into the attack, it would also be supported by the 66th British Mortar Company. They had 4.2-inch mortars, so that's about 106 mils, 18 tubes there. They also had the fires of the 7th Medium Regiment Royal Artillery and a battery from the 64th Medium Regiment. Deception planning, and we spent 2 episodes going over the deception planning for 2nd Alamein, so it was a big part of the operation. But deception planning dictated how many guns could be used in the attack because there physically wasn't enough space to put all of the guns that were available there. When they crossed the line, 30th Corps would be supported by 408 25-pounders and 48 medium guns. That works out to be 1 gun for every 17 metres of front. And they were planning on an average rate of fire of 2 rounds per gun per minute. Against them, the enemy had 200 field guns and 54 heavy and mediums. Within 9th Division, there were now almost 12,000 men, and the RAA regiments, the Royal Australian Artillery, they were now the 2nd most numerous within 9th Infantry Division. So they comprised their headquarters, 3 field regiments, other regimental units under command, which included the heavy and light, anti-aircraft, anti-tank and survey elements. Brigadier Alamein Ramsay had been building up his artillery headquarters staff, and by October he had 6 officers and 23 other ranks. The key appointment within headquarters RAA 9th Division was the Brigade Major RAA, and that would be filled for the battle by Major Hilton or Bill Williams. During World War I, he'd been in the 15th Field Brigade as a captain, and his first staff appointment was as Staff Captain, Headquarters RAA, 1st Australian Corps. So not a strong technical gunnery background, but a very strong employment of artillery background, really across all of the staff work that needs to be done to be able to concentrate fires as they did in the First World War. These are the skills that would be required in spades, and he was able to deliver on it extremely well. He was a stickler for detail and accuracy in the operational orders that he would produce for Brigadier Ramsay. Let's look at the German artillery. A panzer division would have an artillery field regiment supporting it, and that would consist of a regimental headquarters and 2 or sometimes 3 battalions of 12 105mm guns and 1 battalion of 8 150mm howitzers. And you had about 89 officers and 2,000 other ranks in that organisation. Within the division, there would be a Panzer Grenadier Brigade, and that would field 6 150mm gun howitzers, either self-propelled or towed, and 58 81mm mortars. Allies found the 81mm to be a particularly effective weapon system. The Germans were not only experts in their employment, but also in the concealment of the 81mm mortar. It was very hard to find either by aerial photography, flash spotting, sound ranging, and indeed during 2nd Alamein, more casualties would be caused by mortar fire than from the field artillery. The German Infantry Division, so here we're specifically looking at the 90th Light Division, had the same field artillery regiment organisation. However, they also had an organic assault artillery of 75mm guns. Or, in the case of the 90th Light, they had Russian 76.2mm guns. So it was difficult to, when you were trying to work out the enemy hostile battery list, difficult to work out what equipment each of the divisions was using because they had quite a large mix. And interestingly enough, the Germans were using some Russian guns that they had captured. This created a lot of issues from a sustainment point of view because not only do you need to get ammunition of a different caliber, but you're also going to require different components to support them as parts wear out. This description of the German Orbat and equipment comes from Alan Smith's Battle Winners, an excellent read. There's a lot of really good information in there. And he goes on to discuss the fact that the most dangerous artillery piece that the Germans possessed was the 88mm flak GP gun. So this gun fired fixed ammunition, and that means that there's no different charge increments there. It had a very high muzzle velocity. So this is around 3,000 feet per second. To put that into context, the 25-pounder had a muzzle velocity between 650 and 1,750 feet per second. That very high muzzle velocity made it an excellent platform for engaging enemy tanks out to a significant range, and it outranged all of the Allied guns for anti-tank fire. It was originally designed as a naval anti-aircraft artillery piece in 1914. An improved version made its debut on land in 1917, and its utility in the ground role was soon recognised. The solid shot that it fired in the anti-tank role was highly destructive to tanks, fortifications, and machine gun posts. It also had an airburst shell, an extremely accurate weapon. The gun and its half-tracked tractor had a very high profile, and it was easily spotted and engaged by observed fire. The Germans used the 88 more as a sniping gun. It was easily distinguished in air photos, as it was always deployed with a heavy machine gun and mortar sections for protection. The 88s came into battle as part of the division's anti-aircraft command, which was organised as 2 heavy batteries of 88s, which is 16 guns, and 2 light batteries of 16 3.7 or 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Now we're going to look at the development of the C2 that was required to enable Montgomery to create the battlefield effects that he wanted from his artillery. And this story starts with Exercise Bumper. Exercise Bumper was probably the largest exercise that the British Army has ever run. It involved 12 divisions, 250,000 personnel, and was run from the 29th of October through to the 3rd of November in 1941. It was an anti-invasion exercise. The scenario was that the enemy had lodged in southern and central England, and the defenders were to counterattack. So there were 2 army corps on each side, and it was directed by General Alan Brooke. Now, he himself was an artilleryman, so obviously he would have had a keen interest to see how the role of artillery played out during the exercise. These exercises, they normally have a team of umpires, and the chief umpire was none other than Montgomery, and he selected Brigadier Kirkman to be his artillery advisor. Kirkman, similar in some respects to Brigadier Ramsay in that he was a staff officer, so less skilled in technical gunnery, much more skilled in the employment of artillery, and particularly employment of artillery at that higher level. Montgomery had said that the business of gunner COs, so the commanding officer of artillery regiments, was first to train their regiments and then to train the infantry brigadiers to use them properly. This is something that had fallen away in the interwar years. Artillery C2 was, to use the technical term, a shambles. This is the way that Kirkman described it. Few officers knew how to handle large groups of guns and how to concentrate fires. There was little understanding of the methodology used to concentrate fires, particularly at higher levels. Within a corps, there's a CCRA. He is the Corps Commander, Royal Artillery. So he is responsible for the employment of the Corps artillery assets. Kirkman found that they lacked the staff and understanding of how to manage their guns. So often the guns were parcelled out to the divisions. The role of the CCMA, so that's the Corps Commander Medium Artillery, was abolished after Dunkirk. So field artillery is generally of calibers between 75 and 105 millimeters. Larger than that, and it's going to be either a medium or a heavy gun. And up until Dunkirk, there had been a CCMA, so that's the Corps Commander Medium Artillery. Because that position had been abolished, it meant that the Corps Commander of the Royal Artillery, he had to control directly the medium and heavy guns. However, he wouldn't have the staff nor the communications capability to be able to do that. And that is if he had the doctrine and the knowledge of how to do it. So the CRA, so that's the Commander Royal Artillery, so this will be the commander of artillery at the divisional level. They often wouldn't have the knowledge or ability to command those guns that were pushed down to them. So they would decentralise even further and they would be pushed to brigades. A brigade would normally have 1 regiment of artillery, so typically 3 or 4 batteries within that. One of the situations that occurred in Exercise Bumper was that an artillery CO, so the commander of an artillery regiment, he was commanding 3 other regiments, whereas the CRA, the commander of the Royal Artillery within the division, he was actually commanding nothing. So all of those regiments had been put down to this one CO, and he was unable to command 4 regiments at once. Most of the guns were left idle. They found it very difficult to switch fires, and the divisions would move into reserve, and they would take the guns with them and therefore out of the fight. We're going directly against one of the characteristics of artillery, which is its flexibility, and we're also struggling with, when you look at the principles of employment, about how we generate cooperation and concentration of fire. There just wasn't the knowledge, doctrine, or understanding of how to generate the concentrations of fires, and also the organisational structure didn't support it. There wasn't enough headquarters capability to be able to provide the command and control, and there wasn't the signals capability either. Of Exercise Bumper, Shelford Bidwell wrote, "What is deplorable in an exercise and a crime in war was that the general failure to provide effective artillery support in the shape of planned and organised fire. The guiding principles for any artilleryman, whether he is supporting a company or a corps, is that the infantry must never be allowed to go into the attack without carefully planned covering fire from every available gun based on the best available information about the enemy." Bidwell there has very succinctly summed up the issues facing the employment of artillery within the Allied armies. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a couple of pages from Gunners at War by Shelford Bidwell, because what he does now is he distills these problems down to what they look like operationally and tactically within 8th Army. So he gives a fairly in-depth description of the artillery fighting that occurred on Rewisat Ridge, which was one of the battles of 1st Alamein. He's describing the duels between the 25-pounders and the tanks, which isn't great for the 25-pounders because it's not a great anti-tank weapon. And he states, "This is the last action of its kind between the 25-pounder and tanks in the desert. It was also the end of an extraordinary chapter in British military history in which unorthodoxy reigned supreme with the most disastrous results. Tactics is really rather a dull subject, except for professional tacticians, and its laws are sets of platitudes. But if ever the truths of these platitudes was given a costly demonstration, it was in the period between the beginning of the battle axe operation in the summer of 1941 and Auchinleck's stand at Alamein. It was not merely a question of misusing the artillery, it was part of a wider malaise. Instead of concentration, there was extreme dispersion, which cannot be accounted for, attributing it to Liddell Hartism or any other theory. It seems to have grown out of the habit of planning from a small-scale map. Nothing is more deceptive than these coloured ovals and arrows unchecked by the measurement of times and distances and a look at the ground. It made control almost impossible. On a battlefield demanding the utmost mobility, the brigades were locked up in defensive localities. The Guards Brigade Group, having been fully motorised and converted into Panzer Grenadiers, were told off to garrison the Knightsbridge box and to send their transport away. Cooperation, which is the fruit of mutual understanding forged in the training which is essential preliminary to successful campaigns, was destroyed by a command system which despised conventional formations and command channels and broke up formations as if they were composed of chessmen and not living soldiers with their prejudices and peculiarities and deep-rooted desire for the command at the moment of danger by a man they know. Admittedly, the apparatus of command was imperfect. The Royal Corps of Signals, without whom, of course, an army is like an animal without a nervous system, had suffered from starvation in the interwar years like everyone else. But the method of command seems to have degenerated into a series of discussions and visits. 4 days elapsed between Aberdeen was decided upon and the commander of the 5th Indian Divisions left one discussion believing some totally different operation was intended. The whole thing is inexplicable, and not the least inexplicable feature of it is the career of General Gott, who seemed to favour these methods, and in an era where commanders were regularly sacked, he survived to be recommended for the command of the 8th Army, having been worsted in almost every encounter he had with the enemy. Everyone knows how all of these extravagances ended with the arrival of Montgomery, and dull orthodoxy and military success were substituted for brilliant improvisation, confusion, heroism, and failure. Kirkman was flown out to him after the Battle of El Halfa to be his chief artillery officer, the BRA, and to make a good fire plan for his projected offensive. The days of Uniacke and the GOC&C of Royal Artillery had vanished, and the BRA was merely an advisor, unable to give orders except through the General Staff. But Kirkman, armed, as he put it, with the immense authority of the new army commander, put in hand some essential reorganisation. Under the previous command, the brigade group system had reduced the artillery commanders to a position in which they had no role or responsibility, had difficulty in exercising their authority, and their views were often disregarded. Indeed, there had been a move in the Middle East to abolish them. At corps level, the CCRA had inadequate staff and no signals to carry out his vital role. Between August 1941 and July 1942, the Corps Commander Royal Artillery at each corps had been changed once, and the BRA 3 times. At the crisis of one battle, the BRA was sent off to command some scratch force and later relieved by a lieutenant colonel who was not even given acting rank. Only the Australian and New Zealand divisions were able to resist any alteration of their organisation, as this was a matter for their own governments, and their artillery chain of command had remained on the standard pattern. This having been satisfactorily settled, fire planning for the battle was able to begin. For the first time since the false dawn of 1940, the army moved into the assault under the protection of carefully timed and controlled programs based on the best target intelligence. 12 days and 1.5 million rounds later, the Axis defences at Alamein were finally broken. Now, we've covered quite a bit of ground in this episode. What I'm going to do is I'll finish up here. We're going to come back next week and continue to look at... Now we're going to start looking at some of the tactical tasks that were performed as a part of the artillery support for the Second Battle of El Alamein. Do check out the show notes. When I get to put them up, I'll include a little bit of a table because we've talked about some complicated C2 elements here, command and control. So I'll put a little bit of a table in there to sort of make things a little bit clearer for everyone. Really important to understand, though, the requirements for adequate command and control, because this is what everything is underpinned by. Not only that, you then need the doctrine to be able to support it, and critically, you need the signallers to be able to get the communications going between the various levels of command. As always, if you've gotten anything out of today's podcast, please like or share it if you see it on social media, or, include it in your PME program.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.